Okay, Renaissance and Reformation, and this is going to be part two, and it's going to cover the art and architecture during the Renaissance. So the Renaissance and really why it started in Italy. So a new interest in learning about the classical civilizations of the Greeks and the Romans developed in the city-states of Italy in the 1400s, which makes sense. That's where the Roman Empire was. And this led to a period of great intellectual and artistic creativity known as the Renaissance, which means the rebirth. So it's the rebirth of the Greek and Roman civilizations, really what it is. So the Renaissance is often considered one of the greatest turning points in the history of Western civilization. And the Renaissance begins in Italy mainly because of its location on the Mediterranean. So trade between Asia and Europe now increases after the Crusades and everything else. The cities of Italy emerge as the centers of all of this trade. So the centers of banking, commerce, and handicrafts. And you can see how split up Italy was at that time. So Genoa, Pisa, Venice all became important centers of Mediterranean trade. And since this is the home of the Pope, all right, there was also a lot of money coming in from the taxes on Roman Catholics at that time. So Italy has a bunch of money is really what they're trying to say. So the city-states of Milan, Florence, and Siena grew wealthy from banking, farming, and making goods. And then Italian city-states also flourished because there was no single ruler. So there's no king of Italy at that time. They're all their own independent little countries. So the peninsula had not been united and had not had, they got to keep their independence. So during the Renaissance, wealthy Italian merchants and nobles acted as patrons. And this is really important. So patrons are wealthy people who actually pay artists to stay home and paint. So you didn't have to worry about getting a job. You actually got to work on your art all day long. So they supported artists, they supported writers, and they supported scholars. And then you have secularism actually start to creep in. And now people began to show more interest in the real world. So in other words, the here and now rather than the afterlife and worrying about getting to heaven and things like that. So secularism is going away from religion, really. People use observation, experiment, and experience to explain the world rather than simply having the blind faith that we had been talking about earlier on. So they're going away from the church teachings and they're starting to have their own ideas. So in Italy, scholars were still surrounded by the remains of the ancient civilizations, the Greeks and the Romans. They were impressed by the achievements of pre-Christian artists and thinkers. Remember, your Greeks were the ones who believed that humans could reason. So like the ancient Greeks, Renaissance thinkers believed in the power of human reason to explain the world. They looked on man as the focus of all things. Humanists placed great emphasis on the dignity, worth, and uniqueness of each person. So humanists believe that all people are different and unique and very important. So the impact of the Renaissance, we're going to cover a lot of different things. This is kind of the introduction. So the Renaissance artists, architects, scholars, and writers and scientists created a legacy of achievement that still influences us today. So this is going to be the start of the modern age. So the first ones we're going to look at is the painting and sculptures of the time. So before the Renaissance, art in Italy was greatly influenced by the Byzantine styles. Remember, the Byzantines did the mosaics and they did the icons. So everything was extremely religious. So religious paintings were highly decorative, often with gold and jewels, but they were very flat and unlifelike, like this picture right here, or this painting. So figures often floated in space, which you would have here. There's really no shadows. The size of the figure a lot of times was based on how important they were rather than actually what they would look like, and not where a person is placed, rather how important they were. So this all changes. So in the 1300s, a painter, Giotto, had already astonished Italians by just by simply making this new style to where he actually started to make figures lifelike in space, put them where they would be naturally. So Giotto's figures stood firmly on the ground, okay, like regular people, became smaller as they receded back into space and were given depth by realistic shading, and they showed emotion and gestures. So this is a self-portrait of him. This is a painting of himself. And we still kind of see this as basic, but this is kind of the start of people getting smaller in the background and then the background starting to recede, starting to have some three-dimensional design to them. And then you see how much they advanced. So during the Renaissance, each generation of Italian artists made improvements to make their paintings more realistic. Their challenge was to show three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional surface. So Masaccio, probably pronounced that wrong, and other artists developed the rules of perspective. So they actually came up with the mathematical rules of perspective, using guidelines to calculate how things would recede into the distance until they reached a vanishing point to where your eye couldn't see anymore. So these artists also introduced shadows and other realistic effects. So you can see the perspective, and then the vanishing points are going to be back here where, just like we would if you were to step outside or take a picture. So this really is a big improvement from the art that we saw earlier on. So High Renaissance, this is going to be the peak or the golden era of Renaissance. So Italian painting reached its peak during the High Renaissance with the painting of Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael. So Da Vinci, who was around from 1452 to 1519, was a sculptor. He was an inventor as well as a painter of such works as the Mona Lisa and the Last Supper. I'll show you both of those. That Mona Lisa is on this slide right here. So Da Vinci discovered how to use shading, and he also used blurred lines, especially on the mouth and on eyes, to make his subject appear more incredibly lifelike, all things that we do today. So Leonardo also was one of the best scientific minds of his time. To understand human anatomy, he actually went out and he dissected human corpses. So his notebooks include designs for the parachute, the machine gun, several other things, which I'll go through real quickly, but we'll cover them in class. So here's some of Da Vinci's paintings. The Mona Lisa. A lot of people believe the Mona Lisa is just a self-portrait of him because he did a self-portrait sketch and it actually fits right over the Mona Lisa's face. You can almost put them exactly together. There's the Last Supper up at the top. And some of his inventions. Huge crossbow. This is the first tank design. Of course, a flying machine, as they would say back then. This was it looks like almost a screw-like device, but it's kind of like a helicopter. This is a machine gun, looks like a rake, but each one of these would shoot out bullets, and there's a parachute. All right, so Michelangelo. Michelangelo was a Florentine artist. His major sculptures such as the David, the Moses, and Pieta were startlingly realistic, just like the paintings of the time. So he's using these same ideas that other Renaissance artists are using for his sculptures. So each sculpture was carved from a single slab of marble. So this is one piece of marble, and then he would carve it out. His giant fresco painting of the Bible scenes on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel in Rome is considered one of the greatest works of art of all time. And what a fresco is, it's a painting made on fresh plaster. So it's a fresh plaster on the ceiling, and then he's painting into that. So Michelangelo's sculptures and paintings equally glorified the human form. So in other words, he showed them more realistic, kind of back the way the Greeks used to do it. And in architecture, so buildings. So Renaissance architects studied the ruins of the buildings of the ancient Rome, of ancient Rome, and developed new Renaissance style. They abandoned the pointed arches and ornamentation of the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages just, it went way overboard when they did architecture. So they used columns and circular arches of ancient architecture for a simpler, more classical design. In the early Renaissance Florence, citizens built a large cathedral, but they didn't know how to complete the giant roof that they wanted to make, which is this roof right here. So they held a competition among different architects. And I would say Brunelleschi, who studied Roman buildings, so he studied how they used to be made in the past, was chosen as the winner. He developed a dome that created an immense interior space. At the time, the cathedral in Florence was the largest church in the world. And this is the inside of the dome of the ceiling, or of the roof.